The arrival. Aliyah adjusted the rearview mirror of her worn beige sedan, taking a deep breath to calm the butterflies in her stomach. Her heart beat in a mix of excitement and trepidation. This new nanny job was her ticket to a brighter future, a chance to pay off some debts, finally pursue her dreams, and gain the independence she'd craved for so long. The agency had assured her this was a prestigious family who needed a reliable caretaker, and Aliyah had promised herself she would be just that. She was ready, or so she thought. As she stepped out of her car, the scene before her was like something out of a magazine. The sprawling mansion gleamed in the late morning sunlight, pristine and imposing. Its perfectly white exterior contrasted with the lush green lawn dotted with meticulously arranged flower beds. Every petal looked as if it had been deliberately placed, every blade of grass meticulously trimmed. Two luxury vehicles sat parked in the circular driveway, a sleek black sports car and a gleaming white SUV. Everything about this place exuded wealth, power, and untouchable perfection. She walked toward the grand entrance, her footsteps echoing softly against the stone path leading to the door. Just as she reached for the doorbell, she hesitated. Aliyah had worked for well-off families before, but none like this. There was something about the house, a quiet coldness, a detached feeling, as if it were all for show rather than a true home. Shaking off the feeling, she pressed the doorbell, and the chime echoed through the house in a melody that felt almost too cheerful for the setting. The door swung open, and there stood Sarah, the mother of the household, with an impeccable smile and an outfit that looked straight off the pages of a high-fashion catalog. Her blonde hair cascaded around her shoulders in perfect waves, and her demeanor was warm yet controlled, her movements calculated. Aliyah. Sarah's voice was soft and welcoming, but her eyes carried an intensity that contradicted her friendly smile. "Thank you so much for coming. Please, come inside." As Aliyah stepped through the threshold, the grandeur of the interior took her breath away. High ceilings soared above, chandeliers glittered with every movement, and the floors shone under her feet, polished to perfection. Artworks adorned the walls, each piece so expertly chosen that it almost felt like stepping into a museum rather than a family home. It was stunning, yet there was a chill in the air that went beyond the temperature. The coldness seemed to seep from the walls, as if even the house itself was holding its breath. They walked down a long hallway as Sarah led Aliyah to the main living area. As they passed, Aliyah noticed subtle details, a picture frame tilted slightly off-center, a hairline crack in the molding near the door. In a house so pristine, these small imperfections stood out like shadows in bright light, but she brushed it off as wear and tear. They entered the kitchen, a vast, gleaming space with every modern amenity imaginable. Granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, and an island large enough to host a banquet dominated the room. Aliyah set her purse down and glanced around, taking in her new workspace. This would be her domain, the place where she would prepare meals for the children, tidy up, and find her rhythm in this unfamiliar environment. "You'll find everything you need here," Sarah said, her voice soft but with an underlying firmness. "And I trust you to take care of the children as if they were your own. They mean everything to me." Aliyah nodded, reassured by the warmth in Sarah's voice. There was something vulnerable in her tone, as if she was revealing a piece of herself that was normally hidden. But just as quickly, the moment passed, and Sarah's demeanor returned to the perfectly poised woman she had met at the door. As Sarah gave her a tour of the rest of the house, Aliyah noticed other small details that didn't quite fit with the immaculate surroundings. There were faint scuff marks on the hardwood floors in the hallway, as though someone had dragged something heavy. Aliyah's gaze lingered on them, but Sarah quickly drew her attention to a painting on the wall, describing its significance with an air of indifference that struck Aliyah as strange. When they reached the children's rooms, Aliyah felt a wave of warmth. Toys were neatly stored in baskets, colorful blankets were folded at the foot of the beds, and pictures were carefully pinned to corkboards. It was clear that these rooms were spaces of laughter and imagination. untouched by the eerie stillness that lingered in the rest of the house. As they returned downstairs, Alia heard faint voices from a closed door at the far end of the hallway. She couldn't make out what was being said, but she felt the unmistakable tension in the air. The muffled sounds reminded her of something she'd rather forget. Voices raised in anger, too quiet to understand, but loud enough to make her stomach clench. Sarah seemed to sense her discomfort and quickly led her away, her tone light and casual as if nothing were amiss. "Everything's going to be fine here, Alia," Sarah said, her voice almost pleading, as if convincing herself as much as Alia. "You'll be a perfect fit for our family." Later, as Alia settled into her duties, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that all was not as it seemed. She moved through her tasks mechanically, her mind racing with questions she couldn't ask aloud. Little things began to catch her attention: a vase slightly askew on a side table, a chipped edge on the marble counter, and once, as she passed a mirror in the hallway, she caught a glimpse of her own reflection, noticing how tense her face had become. She chalked it up to nerves and told herself to focus. She was here to work, to provide stability for the children, and to help this family. She couldn't afford to let her imagination run wild. That night, Alia lay awake in her small room on the third floor, her mind replaying the events of the day. She tried to ignore the strange, creeping feeling that had settled in her chest, but the echoes of faint voices and the look in Sarah's eyes lingered with her, as if the house itself were whispering secrets she wasn't meant to hear. The silence of the night was heavy and deep, and Alia closed her eyes, hoping tomorrow would bring some clarity. She was here for a new beginning, a fresh start, and nothing, not even the unease that tugged at her, would stand in her way. Little did she know that her journey in this house had only just begun. The unsettling routine. Morning light filtered through Alia's window, casting a soft glow on her modest room. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying yesterday's events in her mind. Every detail of the pristine home and Sarah's practiced smile lingered with her, making it impossible to shake the vague sense of unease. She shook her head, chastising herself for her paranoia. This was an opportunity, a good-paying job, a chance to save, a step closer to her goals. She couldn't let her imagination jeopardize it. Steeling herself, she rose, dressed, and prepared for her first full day in the house. As she descended the staircase, the house was quiet. Too quiet, she thought. But before she could dwell on it, the silence was broken by the sound of footsteps. Alia turned to see Sarah entering the kitchen, her face glowing as she held a small boy by the hand. His brown curls bounced as he moved, and his big round eyes looked at Alia with a mixture of curiosity and shyness. "This is Tommy," Sarah said, her voice soft, but carrying that underlying firmness again. "He's 4, a sweet boy, very quiet." Alia crouched down to Tommy's level, offering a warm smile. "Hi, Tommy. I'm Alia. I'll be here to take care of you and help your mom." Tommy's lips curved into a hesitant smile, and he held onto his mother's hand with a tight grip, his eyes darting between her and Alia. The routine was simple: breakfast, playtime, some educational activities, and lunch. Alia went about her tasks, guiding Tommy through the day. She found joy in his innocent laughter, in the way his eyes sparkled when he learned something new. Her unease started to fade as she immersed herself in the familiarity of childcare. It was a skill she knew well and took pride in. The day passed peacefully until the late afternoon, when a new figure entered the house. A tall man, dressed sharply in a tailored suit, strode into the kitchen. His presence commanded attention, his movements confident, almost too deliberate. Alia recognized him immediately as Mr. Dalton, the husband and father of the household. He looked at her with an appraising eye, nodding curtly as Sarah introduced them. "This is my husband, Richard," Sarah said with a tense smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Dalton." Alia greeted him with a polite nod. Richard looked her over with a gaze that lingered a moment too long, his expression unreadable. Finally, he extended his hand. "Alia, welcome. I trust my wife has given you everything you need." "Yes, sir. Thank you. The house is beautiful," Alia replied, feeling the coldness of his handshake. He let go quickly, almost dismissively, before turning to Sarah. "I'll be in my office," he said. His tone was clipped, almost as if he were speaking to a subordinate rather than his wife. Sarah nodded, her eyes cast downward as he walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Alia noticed the way Sarah's shoulders sagged slightly as he left, as if she had been holding her breath. When Sarah turned back to her, the cheerful mask was back in place, but Alia didn't miss the way her hands trembled slightly as she straightened Tommy's collar. In the days that followed, Alia settled into her routine with the children, though each day carried an odd tension she couldn't ignore. Sarah would sometimes disappear into her room for hours, emerging with a fixed smile but tired eyes. Alia would often hear muffled conversations, or rather, arguments, from behind closed doors when Richard was home. But whenever he walked into the room, a practiced silence fell, and everyone resumed their tasks with a feigned ease. One morning, as Alia was helping Sarah prepare breakfast, she noticed a faint bruise on Sarah's wrist, just visible beneath the cuff of her blouse. Sarah quickly pulled her sleeve down when she caught Alia's gaze, her eyes flashing with something. Fear, maybe shame. Alia wanted to ask if she was all right, to offer some comfort, but the words stuck in her throat. It wasn't her place, she told herself. And yet, the image of Sarah's bruised wrist haunted her throughout the day. That evening, as Alia was putting the children to bed, she heard a sudden thud from downstairs, followed by a muffled cry. She froze, her heart pounding as she listened. The house was silent for a moment. Then she heard another noise, a voice, low and angry, though the words were too muffled to make out. Her hand shook as she tucked Tommy into bed, murmuring a quick goodnight before rushing back to her room. She closed the door quietly, her heart racing. In the quiet of her room, Alia tried to calm herself. She reasoned that she was jumping to conclusions, that perhaps the sounds were from the television, or something innocent. But a sinking feeling in her gut told her otherwise. She couldn't ignore the look in Sarah's eyes, the bruises, the stifling silence that filled the house whenever Richard was around. The following day, Alia found herself alone with Sarah as the children napped. They sat in the kitchen, sipping coffee in an uneasy silence. Finally, Alia couldn't hold back any longer. She reached across the table, touching Sarah's hand gently. "Are you all right, Sarah?" she asked softly. "I mean, if there's anything you need, anything I can help with." Sarah's eyes flickered with surprise and something close to relief, but then her face shuddered, and she withdrew her hand. "Thank you, Alia," she said, her voice low. "I'm fine, really." But Alia could see that Sarah was anything but fine. Her expression was guarded, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as if holding herself together. Before Alia could press further, they heard footsteps approaching, and Sarah quickly busied herself with the dishes, her posture rigid. Richard entered the kitchen, glancing at Alia with an intensity that made her feel exposed. "How's it going, ladies?" he asked, his tone casual but his gaze piercing. "Just fine," Sarah replied, her voice almost robotic. "Alia and I were discussing the children's schedule." Richard's eyes shifted to Alia, as if assessing her. She forced a polite smile, sensing that he was searching for something in her expression. After a long, uncomfortable pause, he nodded and left the room, his footsteps heavy as they retreated down the hallway. When he was gone, Alia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She turned to Sarah, who was now clutching a dish towel so tightly her knuckles were white. Alia felt a wave of anger surge through her. Whatever was happening in this house, it was wrong. And it was clear that Sarah was suffering under the weight of something she was too terrified to share. Over the next few days, Alia became increasingly vigilant. She noticed every detail, every bruise, every wince, and every frightened glance that passed between Sarah and Richard. And while she knew she was treading dangerous waters, she couldn't bring herself to look away. One evening, As she was tidying the children's playroom after putting them to bed, Aliyah heard a soft knock on her door. She opened it to find Sarah standing there, her face pale, her hands trembling. She looked over her shoulder nervously before stepping into the room and closing the door behind her. "Aliyah, I need your help," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and a fresh bruise marred her cheek, partially hidden beneath her makeup. "Please, don't tell anyone, especially not Richard." Aliyah's heart pounded as she took Sarah's hands, nodding in silent understanding. This was it, the confirmation she'd feared and half expected. Sarah was reaching out, and Aliyah knew she had to be strong for her, even if it meant putting herself at risk. "Tell me what you need, Sarah," Aliyah said, her voice steady but filled with determination. "I'll help you, I promise." In that moment, Aliyah understood the gravity of her role in this household. She wasn't just the nanny. She was about to become something much more. An ally, a lifeline, a friend. And as she listened to Sarah's quiet, fearful words, Aliyah knew she would do whatever it took to help her escape from the nightmare that lurked behind the closed doors of this perfect house. Unveiling secrets. The silence in Aliyah's room felt thick and oppressive as she listened to Sarah's shaky breathing, each exhale heavy with the weight of what she was about to reveal. Aliyah closed the door softly, glancing down the hallway to ensure no one had overheard Sarah's entrance. She motioned for Sarah to sit on the edge of the bed, offering her a comforting smile. It was clear from the dark circles under her eyes and the tension in her shoulders that Sarah hadn't slept well in weeks, maybe even months. Sarah sat, her hands twisting the edge of her blouse, her knuckles white. She looked like a woman teetering on the edge, barely holding herself together. Aliyah knelt beside her, squeezing Sarah's hand in silent reassurance, waiting for her to speak on her own terms. "I don't know where to start," Sarah whispered, her voice brittle and frayed. She looked down, avoiding Aliyah's gaze. "I haven't told anyone. I've been too scared to, ashamed." Aliyah kept her voice low, soft, unthreatening. "You can tell me anything, Sarah. I'm here for you. I'll help you any way I can." Sarah's lip quivered, and she took a trembling breath. "Richard wasn't always like this," she said, her voice laced with a strange mixture of sorrow and nostalgia. "When we first met, he was charming, attentive, everything I thought I wanted. He made me feel like I was the center of his world." Her gaze drifted, lost in a memory that was both sweet and bitter. "But it changed, slowly at first, in ways I didn't even notice." Aliyah nodded, letting Sarah take her time. She knew that for some people, putting words to trauma was a painfully slow process. "It started with little things," Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "He criticized my cooking, the way I dressed, the way I looked after Tommy. At first, I brushed it off. I told myself he was just stressed from work, that I could be better, make things perfect for him." Her face twisted in a self-deprecating smile, and Aliyah felt a pang of empathy. "He would apologize afterward," Sarah said, her eyes filling with unshed tears. "He would bring me flowers, say he was sorry. And for a while, things would be calm. But then, it got worse. He became more controlling. He'd dictate what I could wear, who I could talk to. He even started checking my phone. I didn't realize how deeply trapped I was until one day I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize myself. The bruises, the haunted look in her eyes, the hollow smile, all of it suddenly made sense to Aliyah. She felt a surge of anger toward Richard, a deep, visceral rage at the thought of him chipping away at Sarah's spirit piece by piece. "Why didn't you leave?" Aliyah asked gently, though she already knew the answer. "Fear, isolation, shame. It was the trap countless women found themselves in." Sarah let out a shaky laugh. "Leave? I have nowhere to go, Aliyah. He controls all the money, the house. Even my family doesn't understand. They think I'm ungrateful for not appreciating my perfect life." She sighed, her shoulders sagging under the weight of her situation. He's always telling me that if I tried to leave, he'd take Tommy from me, that he has the connections, the money to make sure I'd never see him again. Aaliyah squeezed Sarah's hand, her heart aching for this woman who felt utterly alone and trapped. "You don't have to go through this by yourself," she said firmly. "You're not alone, Sarah. I'm here with you now. We'll find a way." Sarah looked up, her eyes filled with a glimmer of hope, but also a deep-seated fear. "I don't know how," she whispered. "He's everywhere. Watching, listening. He has cameras in every room, checks my emails. I don't even feel safe in my own home." Aaliyah's mind raced. She'd had no idea the extent of Richard's control. She'd heard of men like him, but witnessing the effects firsthand was something else entirely. It was as though he'd stripped Sarah of her autonomy piece by piece, until she was merely an extension of his will. They sat in silence for a few moments, Aaliyah's mind working to figure out a plan. Any way to help Sarah escape the stranglehold Richard had on her life. "There has to be a way to keep you safe," Aaliyah murmured, more to herself than to Sarah. "If we're careful, we can gather evidence, something concrete that can help you get away from him for good." Sarah's eyes widened in fear. "If he finds out." "He won't," Aaliyah interrupted gently, squeezing her hand. "I'll help you, but we'll take it one step at a time. I promise we'll be careful." Over the next few days, Aaliyah kept a close eye on Richard's routines and behaviors, noting the times he'd leave for work, the hours he'd spend in his office. She paid attention to where the cameras were located, carefully maneuvering herself and Sarah to avoid them when they talked. She could see the toll this secrecy was taking on Sarah. Every interaction felt like walking on eggshells, and Aaliyah had to constantly remind herself not to let her anger show. Any misstep could lead to Richard's suspicion, and she couldn't afford to jeopardize Sarah's safety. One evening, when Richard was out for a business dinner, Aaliyah and Sarah met in the kitchen, their voices low as they discussed a plan. Sarah had managed to find an old, unused cell phone hidden in a drawer. It was outdated but functional, and Aaliyah decided they could use it to keep communications secret, only turning it on when absolutely necessary. "It's a start," Aaliyah said, examining the phone. "We can use this to document things, to record anything that could help you when you're ready to leave." Sarah nodded, looking at the phone as though it were a lifeline. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how I could do this without you." For the first time, Aaliyah saw a spark of determination in Sarah's eyes. It was a small ember, but it was there. And Aaliyah knew that with time and the right support, that ember could grow into a fire strong enough to break free from Richard's grasp. Their plan progressed slowly. Sarah documented injuries, recorded conversations on the hidden phone when Richard's cruelty slipped into the open. Aaliyah acted as lookout, often sneaking into Richard's office when he was out to gather any documents that might aid Sarah's escape. It was nerve-wracking work, each day carrying the risk of discovery, but Aaliyah knew that the stakes were worth it. She would do anything to see Sarah and Tommy safe. One evening, as Aaliyah was putting Tommy to bed, the little boy looked up at her with innocent eyes and asked a question that nearly broke her heart. "Aaliyah, why is Mommy always sad?" She knelt beside him, stroking his soft curls, unsure of how to respond. "Your mom loves you very much, Tommy," she said gently. "Sometimes adults have big feelings that are hard to talk about. But your mom is very strong, and she's always thinking of you." Tommy seemed to accept this answer, his small hand reaching out to hold hers. "Will you stay with us, Aaliyah?" Aaliyah's heart squeezed as she looked into his wide, trusting eyes. "Yes, Tommy," she promised. "I'll be here for you and your mom." As she tucked him in, Aaliyah felt the weight of her promise. She was now more than just a nanny. She was a lifeline for Sarah and Tommy, a source of hope in a house shrouded in fear and silence. But Aaliyah knew that Richard wouldn't let his control slip so easily. A storm was brewing, one she could feel with every calculated look he gave her, every suspicious question he asked about her time with Sarah. She needed to act swiftly, to secure a way out before Richard's suspicions solidified. In the quiet of her room that night, Alia prayed for strength, for courage, and for the wisdom to see this plan through without putting herself or Sarah in further danger. Because behind the perfect facade of this beautiful house, Alia was waging a silent battle for Sarah's freedom, a battle she was determined to win, no matter the cost. Shadows in the dark. The weeks passed in a blur of tense whispers, furtive glances, and hidden bruises. Alia and Sarah moved like ghosts through the house, careful not to disturb the carefully constructed world of silence and control that Richard had built. They continued their covert mission, documenting evidence, slowly assembling a lifeline that could help Sarah escape. But with each small victory, the risk seemed to grow, and Alia could feel Richard's suspicions building. Richard was a man who lived for control, for the feeling of dominance, and any hint of resistance or disobedience was something he would seek out like a predator. Alia noticed the way his gaze lingered on her during family dinners, his eyes dark with something unspoken, something watchful. His questions about her work were becoming increasingly pointed, as if he were probing for cracks in her carefully constructed facade of dutiful professionalism. One night, as she was cleaning up in the kitchen after the children were asleep, Richard entered the room, his footsteps slow and deliberate, his presence filling the space with an oppressive weight. Alia stiffened, feeling his gaze settle on her as she scrubbed the countertop, willing herself to appear calm. "Alia," he said, his voice deceptively smooth, "I notice you've been spending quite a lot of time with Sarah. I suppose she appreciates the company." "Yes, sir," Alia replied, keeping her tone steady. "Mrs. Dalton's been very kind to me." He walked closer, and Alia could feel the tension radiating off him, an almost tangible force pressing down on her. "She doesn't really need too much help, does she?" he asked, his voice low and laced with an edge. "After all, she has you to look after the children. I'd hate for her to feel overwhelmed." Alia swallowed, sensing the threat beneath his words. "I'm just here to help wherever I can, Mr. Dalton. It's my job." He tilted his head, studying her, his eyes narrowing. "Yes, of course. But let's keep things professional, shall we? I'd hate for there to be any misunderstandings." He paused, his gaze cold and unfeeling. "I trust that's clear." Alia nodded, feeling a chill run down her spine as he turned and left the kitchen, his footsteps echoing down the hall. She stood there for a moment, clutching the sponge in her hand, her heart racing. He knew something was off, she could feel it, and if he caught wind of their plan, there would be no telling what he might do to punish Sarah, or her. The following morning, as Alia was preparing breakfast, Sarah appeared in the doorway, looking even more exhausted than usual. A fresh bruise shadowed her cheekbone, half hidden beneath a layer of makeup. Alia's heart ached at the sight of her, but she forced herself to keep her expression neutral. Richard was likely within earshot. "Good morning, Sarah," Alia said brightly, setting a plate of pancakes on the counter. "How did you sleep?" Sarah gave her a tight smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, you know, the usual." But Alia could see the tension in her shoulders, the fear lingering just beneath the surface. Sarah glanced around, her eyes darting toward the hallway before she spoke in a low voice. "We need to be careful," she whispered. He's watching me more closely. Last night, she trailed off, her gaze dropping to the floor. Alia reached across the counter, placing a reassuring hand on Sarah's. "We're going to get you out of this, Sarah," she murmured. "We're close, just a little longer." Sarah nodded, her eyes filling with unshed tears. She squeezed Alia's hand, a silent thank you that carried the weight of everything she couldn't say out loud. That evening, after putting the children to bed, Alia met Sarah in the laundry room, one of the few places in the house without a camera. They'd learned over time that it was the safest spot to talk, a small, windowless room where the hum of the washer and dryer masked their whispered conversations. "I found an organization that can help," Alia said, handing Sarah a small piece of paper with a number scrawled on it. They work with women in situations like yours. They'll help you with legal protection, a safe place to stay, and anything else you might need." Sarah took the paper, her fingers trembling. "You think they'll really help me?" "They specialize in cases like yours," Alia said, her voice steady. "But you have to be ready. Once you make the call, things will move fast. There won't be any turning back." Sarah stared at the paper, her expression a mixture of hope and terror. She looked at Alia, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't want to leave without Tommy." "We'll get him out with you," Alia promised. "But we have to be careful. We'll plan it down to every last detail. He won't know until it's too late." They outlined their plan, timing every step meticulously. Alia would take Tommy to a nearby park under the pretense of an outing, while Sarah would gather a few essential items and head to a prearranged safe house. Alia would meet her there with Tommy, and the organization would step in to ensure their safety. The plan was risky, but Alia knew it was their best chance. The day finally arrived, a gray morning with clouds looming heavy in the sky. Alia dressed Tommy warmly, gathering his favorite toys and snacks for the special day at the park. Sarah tried to appear calm, but her hands trembled as she kissed Tommy goodbye, her eyes red and puffy. She lingered a moment too long, her gaze filled with a mother's desperate love, and Alia had to gently remind her to let go. As Alia walked Tommy toward the park, she felt a surge of anxiety. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting Richard to be following them. But the street was quiet, and she took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure for Tommy's sake. They arrived at the park, and Tommy ran ahead, his laughter ringing out as he raced toward the swings. Alia checked her watch, counting down the minutes until Sarah would be safely en route to the safe house. She kept her eyes on Tommy, her heart pounding with each passing second. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she spotted a familiar figure. Richard. He was standing at the entrance to the park, his face set in a grim expression, his gaze locked onto her. Alia's heart lurched, and she fought to keep her expression neutral as he approached, his stride purposeful and menacing. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "Just spending time with Tommy," Alia replied, forcing a calm smile. Sarah wanted him to get some fresh air. Richard's eyes narrowed, his gaze flicking between her and Tommy. "And where is Sarah?" "She said she needed a moment to rest. I thought it would be nice for Tommy to get out of the house." He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable, and then he turned his gaze to Tommy, who was blissfully unaware, swinging happily and laughing. Richard's face softened momentarily, but when he looked back at Alia, his eyes were cold. "You're quite devoted, aren't you?" he said, his voice dripping with suspicion. "But I'll be watching, Alia. Don't forget that." Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Alia trembling. She waited until he was out of sight, her mind racing with fear. If he'd noticed anything strange in her behavior, if he'd followed her here, he would certainly have guessed what was happening. She looked at Tommy, still playing happily, and felt a surge of protectiveness. She would get him and Sarah to safety, no matter what. Returning to the house, Alia found Sarah's room empty, the closet door ajar. Her heart skipped a beat as she quickly gathered Tommy and took him to her car, praying that Sarah had made it safely to the rendezvous point. She drove with her hands gripping the wheel, constantly checking the rearview mirror, half expecting Richard to appear behind her. When she finally arrived at the safe house, her heart leaped as she saw Sarah standing at the door, looking frail but determined. She opened the door, and Tommy ran into her arms, his small voice filling the space with laughter as he hugged her tightly. Alia felt a wave of relief wash over her as she watched them, mother and son reunited, free from Richard's oppressive grasp. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. They had taken the first step toward freedom, toward a life free of fear and control. As she watched Sarah hold Tommy, Alia felt her own tears well up. She'd been a stranger in this house, an outsider looking in, But now, she felt like she'd finally found her purpose. She'd been there to help Sarah find her strength, to show her that she wasn't alone. And as they stood together in the safety of the shelter, Alia knew she'd do it all over again if it meant saving a life, protecting a family, and bringing light to a life shrouded in darkness. Fractured foundations. In the days that followed their escape, Alia, Sarah, and Tommy began the slow, painstaking process of building a new life. The shelter was a small, nondescript building tucked away in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. The walls were plain, the rooms simple, but to Sarah, it was a sanctuary, a place where she could breathe without fear, without the oppressive weight of Richard's control looming over her every move. For Tommy, it was an adventure. He embraced the new environment with innocent excitement, blissfully unaware of the turmoil that had brought them there. Alia spent her days helping Sarah acclimate to her new surroundings, navigating the logistics of their escape with the support of the shelter's staff. The organization Alia had contacted specialized in assisting survivors of domestic abuse, providing not only shelter but also legal aid, counseling, and resources for rebuilding lives fractured by trauma. Sarah was finally safe, but the scars of her past, both visible and invisible, were deep and complex. One morning, after a particularly restless night, Sarah sat with Alia in the small common area, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, her eyes distant. She hadn't been sleeping well, plagued by nightmares and memories of Richard's cruelty. It was as though he still held her in his grasp, haunting her every thought. "It still doesn't feel real," Sarah murmured, her voice barely audible. She glanced around the room, her gaze unfocused. "I keep expecting him to walk through that door, to pull me back." Alia reached across the table, placing a comforting hand over Sarah's. "You're free now," she said gently. "He can't reach you here, and you're not alone." Sarah nodded, but the uncertainty in her eyes remained. "I don't know who I am without him," she admitted. "For so long, I've been trapped in his world, molded by his rules. It's like I forgot how to be me." Alia squeezed her hand, feeling the weight of Sarah's struggle. "Then we'll find out together," she said firmly. "One step at a time." The shelter arranged for Sarah to meet with a counselor, a gentle, compassionate woman named Carla, who specialized in trauma recovery. Sarah was hesitant at first, reluctant to open up about the darkest parts of her life. But slowly, over the course of several sessions, she began to peel back the layers of her pain, releasing emotions she had long buried. Carla helped her understand that the feelings of shame and self-blame she carried were not hers to bear, that the isolation and fear she had experienced were the calculated effects of Richard's manipulation. Sarah began to see, perhaps for the first time, that the darkness she had lived in was not her fault, that she had been a victim of someone else's cruelty and control. As she processed these realizations, a small spark of resilience ignited within her, a glimmer of the strength she hadn't known she possessed. While Sarah focused on her emotional recovery, Alia took on the practical tasks of preparing for the future. She attended meetings with the shelter's legal team, who were working to secure a restraining order against Richard. They explained the complexities of the process, the evidence they would need, and the likelihood of facing Richard in court. Each mention of his name sent a shiver down Alia's spine, but she knew it was necessary. They had to ensure Sarah and Tommy's safety, no matter the cost. One afternoon, as Alia was reviewing paperwork with the shelter's lawyer, she received a phone call from an unknown number. She hesitated, a sense of dread washing over her, but she answered. "Alia." A familiar voice spoke, dripping with icy calm. It was Richard. Her stomach twisted, her grip on the phone tightening. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steady but tense. He let out a dark chuckle. "Did you think you could just take my family and disappear? Did you think I wouldn't find you?" Alia's heart pounded, but she forced herself to remain composed. "They're not yours to control, Richard. Sarah and Tommy are safe now." "Safe?" he sneered. "You don't understand, do you? They belong with me. And you, meddling in things you don't understand, "You'll regret this, Alia. I always get what I want." The call ended abruptly, leaving Alia shaken. She sat in silence, the phone still clutched in her hand, her mind racing. She'd known Richard would eventually try to find them, but hearing his voice, his cold, calculating threats, felt like a shadow creeping back over the fragile peace they'd worked so hard to build. Alia immediately reported the call to the shelter staff, and within hours, security protocols were reinforced. The shelter's manager, a no-nonsense woman named Marla, assured her that they were well-equipped to handle threats like Richard's. Additional guards were stationed outside, and all incoming calls were monitored. Yet, despite these precautions, Alia couldn't shake the feeling that Richard's influence stretched farther than they realized. When she told Sarah about the call, she watched her friend's face pale, the old fear resurfacing. "He's not going to stop, is he?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Alia took her hands, grounding her. "No, Sarah. We won't let him control you anymore. The shelter has security, and we're taking every precaution. You're safe here. You have people who care about you now, who won't let him hurt you again." Sarah nodded, but the fear lingered. She knew, as Alia did, that Richard's determination to reclaim control over her life was unyielding. In the following weeks, the tension escalated. Richard's lawyers sent threatening letters, accusing Sarah of kidnapping Tommy and alienating him from his father. Alia could feel the pressure mounting, the legal system's slow, bureaucratic process making every day feel like a tightrope walk. But with the shelter's support, they pressed forward, collecting evidence of Richard's abusive behavior, documenting everything meticulously. Through it all, Sarah showed a strength that Alia hadn't seen before. She was still fragile, still prone to moments of despair, but there was a determination in her that hadn't been there before. She spent hours with Carla, learning coping mechanisms, building resilience, and confronting the years of psychological wounds Richard had inflicted. With every session, she grew stronger, her confidence slowly emerging from beneath the layers of fear and self-doubt. One afternoon, as they were sitting outside the shelter's small garden, Sarah looked at Alia, a new resolve in her gaze. "I'm going to fight him," she said, her voice steady. "Not just for me, but for Tommy. He deserves a life free from all of this. Free from Richard." Alia smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "You're stronger than you know, Sarah, and I'll be with you every step of the way." They prepared for the court battle together, practicing Sarah's statements, reviewing her evidence, and bracing for the inevitable confrontation with Richard. Alia knew it would be brutal. Richard's lawyers would do everything in their power to discredit Sarah, to paint her as an unstable mother unfit to care for Tommy. But Alia also knew that the truth was on their side, and they were ready to fight. The court date finally arrived, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with tension. Alia sat beside Sarah, their hands clasped tightly together, as they watched Richard enter, flanked by his lawyers. His face was impassive, his gaze cold and calculating as he looked at Sarah, but Alia could see the fury simmering beneath his calm exterior. She could feel his hatred directed at her, a silent promise that he would make her pay for standing against him. Sarah took the stand, her voice shaking at first, but as she spoke, her confidence grew. She recounted years of control, manipulation, and abuse, her voice clear and resolute. Alia felt a surge of pride as she watched Sarah confront the man who had once broken her spirit, reclaiming her story in a place where he had no power to silence her. Richard's lawyers tried to undermine her, painting her as unstable, a woman who'd overreacted to minor disagreements. But Sarah held her ground, refusing to be intimidated. She showed the evidence they had gathered, the recordings, the photos, the witness statements from friends who had seen the bruises, and the emotional toll Richard had inflicted. Piece by piece, she dismantled his facade, exposing the darkness that lurked beneath his polished exterior. When Alia was called as a witness, she spoke firmly, detailing everything she had witnessed in the Dalton household. She could feel Richard's eyes on her as she spoke, his silent threat looming. But she held her ground. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was standing up for Sarah, for Tommy, for every person who had been silenced by someone else's cruelty. After hours of testimony and cross-examination, the judge finally ruled in Sarah's favor, granting her full custody of Tommy and a restraining order against Richard. The relief was overwhelming, a flood of emotions that left Sarah sobbing in Aaliyah's arms as the reality of her freedom settled in. As they left the courthouse, Sarah turned to Aaliyah, her face tear-streaked but radiant. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with gratitude. "I never would have made it here without you." Aaliyah hugged her tightly, feeling a sense of fulfillment she hadn't known before. New beginnings. The morning air was crisp as Aaliyah, Sarah, and Tommy walked out of the courthouse. The sky was an endless blue, unmarred by clouds, as if nature itself had conspired to give them a perfect day. Sarah looked up, breathing deeply, her face illuminated by a mixture of relief and joy that Aaliyah hadn't seen before. For the first time since they'd met, Sarah looked free. She was no longer the woman tethered by invisible chains, haunted by her past. She was stepping into her own life, a life she could shape with her own choices, her own dreams, unshadowed by fear. After the trial, the shelter arranged for them to move into a transitional apartment, a cozy two-bedroom place in a quiet neighborhood where Sarah could begin her journey toward independence. The organization would help with rent for the first few months, as well as counseling services and support groups for survivors of abuse. They were invested in seeing Sarah succeed, ensuring she had the resources and tools to rebuild her life. For Tommy, the new apartment was a wonderland. He ran through each room, wide-eyed and laughing, his little hands exploring every surface. Aaliyah smiled as she watched him adjust so easily. In his innocence, he'd been shielded from the darkness that had loomed over them. And now, his laughter filled the quiet apartment with warmth. As the days passed, Aaliyah helped Sarah settle into her new reality, guiding her through the basics of living independently, managing bills, grocery shopping, and budgeting. It was all new for Sarah, who had spent years in Richard's suffocating orbit, her life dictated by his whims. Each task was a small but vital step toward her autonomy. One afternoon, as they sat on the small balcony, Sarah looked out over the neighborhood, her gaze thoughtful. "I still wake up sometimes expecting to be back in that house," she admitted quietly. "I reach for the phone, expecting to see a message from him. I still feel afraid." Aaliyah nodded, understanding. Healing was a slow, winding road, with progress marked by small victories and occasional setbacks. "That's normal, Sarah," she said gently. "You've been through so much, it takes time to adjust, to let go of the habits and fears that kept you safe. But every day, you're growing stronger." Sarah looked at her, gratitude filling her eyes. "I don't know if I would have survived without you, Aaliyah. You showed me that I was worth fighting for, that I deserved a life of my own." Aaliyah reached over, squeezing her hand. "You were always worth it, Sarah. You just needed someone to remind you." In the weeks that followed, Aaliyah continued to support Sarah, but gradually, she began stepping back, encouraging Sarah to make decisions on her own, to trust herself. Sarah joined a support group at the shelter, connecting with other women who had survived similar situations. These women became her community, her sisters in healing, sharing stories of resilience, supporting each other through the trials of recovery. As Sarah opened up, her confidence grew. She began volunteering at the shelter, helping other women find resources, offering them a listening ear, a comforting smile. Her past gave her empathy and understanding that few others could provide. She found strength in helping others, in being a voice for those who hadn't yet found their own. The woman who once lived in silence was now speaking her truth, sharing her story in a way that brought light to others. One evening, after a long day of the shelter, Sarah invited Aaliyah over for dinner. They sat together in the cozy apartment, the aroma of Sarah's homemade lasagna filling the air. Tommy sat nearby, his attention fixed on a stack of brightly colored blocks, his laughter punctuating the warm conversation. Sarah served the meal, her eyes shining with pride. She'd never cooked much before, relying on household staff during her years with Richard. But now, cooking was her way of reclaiming control, of building a home that felt authentically hers. As they ate, Alia noticed how much Sarah had changed. Her once hesitant demeanor had transformed into a quiet confidence. The haunted look in her eyes had softened, replaced by hope. There was a lightness to her that hadn't been there before, a sense of peace that radiated through her movements. "You're different," Alia observed, smiling at her friend. "You seem whole." Sarah nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "I am," she said softly. "For so long, I thought I was broken, that the things Richard did to me had shattered me beyond repair. But now I see that I wasn't broken. I was kept in the dark, but I survived. I found my way back to myself." Alia felt a lump form in her throat, a deep sense of pride swelling within her. "You've come so far, Sarah. You should be proud of yourself." Tears filled Sarah's eyes, but they were tears of joy, of relief. "I am proud, and I'm grateful, to you, to everyone who helped me see that I could be more than his shadow." As they finished dinner, Sarah's face grew thoughtful. "You know, Alia, I want to give back. I want to help other women find their way out, to be the voice I needed when I felt lost. I think that's my purpose now." Alia nodded, recognizing the spark of purpose in her friend's eyes. "You'd be amazing, Sarah. Your story could inspire so many women." Over the next few months, Sarah threw herself into her new role as an advocate. She began working closely with the shelter, organizing workshops on healing and empowerment, speaking at events, and even visiting schools to educate young people about healthy relationships. Her journey had given her a sense of purpose, a mission to help others find freedom from abuse and reclaim their lives. With time, Sarah's story gained attention. A local news station interviewed her, sharing her journey from victim to advocate. She spoke with grace and courage, her voice steady as she recounted her experiences. She didn't hide from the painful parts, acknowledging the scars she carried, but she also spoke of resilience, of finding light in the darkest places. Her story resonated with countless women, sparking conversations, encouraging others to seek help. As Sarah's advocacy grew, so did her confidence. She began taking classes in psychology, dreaming of one day becoming a counselor, helping other women navigate the path to healing. She poured herself into her studies, finding fulfillment in learning, in growing, in building a life that was entirely her own. Alia watched with admiration as Sarah transformed into a woman of strength and compassion, a beacon for others who needed a guiding light. Sarah's friendship had become one of the greatest gifts in Alia's life, a bond forged through hardship, but rooted in resilience. One evening, as they sat together on Sarah's balcony, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Sarah turned to Alia with a smile. "You know, I never thought I'd be here," she said quietly. "I never thought I'd find a life beyond Richard, beyond the walls he built around me." Alia smiled back, her heart full. "You did it, Sarah. You built this life, and it's beautiful." Sarah nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I couldn't have done it without you, Alia. You saved me. You gave me a second chance." They sat in silence, the warmth of their friendship filling the space between them. In the distance, the city lights flickered like stars, a reminder of the countless lives touched by Sarah's courage. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, Alia knew that this was only the beginning for Sarah. She had shed her past, rebuilt her life, and found a purpose rooted in love and resilience. Sarah's journey had transformed her into a woman of strength, compassion, and boundless hope, a woman who would continue to inspire, to heal, and to bring light to others. And as they sat together under the fading sky, Alia felt a deep peace settle within her. She had played a part in Sarah's story, but now it was time for Sarah to soar on her own, to spread her wings and make her mark on the world. Alia knew that wherever life took them, their friendship would remain, a testament to the power of love, courage, and the unbreakable bonds forged in the darkest of times. And as the night embraced them, Alia knew that they had found a happy ending. Not a perfect one, but one filled with hope, growth, and the promise of new beginnings.